One cold winter evening, two lumberjacks named Tom and Jim were making their way home through a large forest filled with tall oak trees. The snow blanketed the ground and everything was still. Even the animals, like foxes and deer, stayed hidden in their cozy nests and dens, avoiding the freezing air. The lumberjacks continued their journey, though with only each other and the trees for company. They silently prayed to Saint Francis, the protector of travelers, to keep them safe. After a while, they spotted the lights of their small village glowing warmly in the distance. Tom and Jim exchanged happy glances, feeling a little more cheerful as they neared home. But as they walked, Tom became thoughtful and muttered, "Why did we ever get so excited? Life is hard for folks like us who have nothing. What good does all this walking do if we're still poor?" Suddenly, something incredible happened. A shining star fell from the sky, casting a radiant glow that lit up the snow around them. "Look!" Jim gasped, pointing. "Maybe we're lucky tonight. Let's go check it out. There could be treasure there." Curious, they made their way to the spot where the light had fallen. But instead of a pot of gold, they found a small, sleeping baby bundled up in a silver blue blanket embroidered with tiny stars. Around the baby's neck hung a simple but elegant chain with a little stone attached to it. Tom, the more practical of the two, frowned. "This isn't treasure, and we already have too many mouths to feed. We can't take in another child." But Jim shook his head. "We can't just leave this poor baby alone in the cold. Look, I'll bring him home. My wife will care for him, even if it's a struggle." With that, Jim gently picked up the baby and held him close, determined to get him home safely. When Jim finally reached his humble home, his wife, Mary, was there to greet him. She wrapped her arms around him, relieved to see him safe. "Guess what I found in the forest?" Jim said, stepping inside. "It's a little something for you." Mary's eyes lit up briefly, thinking he'd found some food or perhaps even a small gift. But when she saw the baby, her excitement turned to frustration. "We're barely getting by, and you bring us another child?" she scolded. But as she looked at the little face, her heart softened. She gently took the baby, wrapped him warmly, and laid him in a small bed. Jim looked at her with a gentle smile. "He came from the stars, I think. Let's call him our forest child. He's meant to be with us, Mary." The baby, whom they called Sam, grew up with Jim and Mary. Year by year, Sam became more and more handsome. His skin was smooth like ivory, his hair glistened like the first autumn leaves, and his eyes shone blue, as deep as a summer sky. The villagers, who mostly had dark features, would often stop to stare at Sam in amazement. Yet, as Sam grew older, he grew more distant from the other children in the forest. He became proud of his good looks and believed he was somehow better than those around him. He would laugh at the poor, turn away from the sick, and even tease the other children for their plain clothes. Jim and Mary noticed this change and often tried to talk to him. "We took you in, Sam, and we loved you as our own, Jim would say. Why do you act so unkindly towards others? But Sam would brush off their words, only half listening. He spent hours admiring his reflection in the village well, lost in the sight of his own face. One warm afternoon, while Sam and his friends were playing by the village square, they saw an old, ragged woman limping towards them. She looked tired and worn from her travels, and her clothes were little more than rags. "Look at that filthy old woman," Sam sneered, loud enough for the others to hear. "Why is she here? She doesn't belong among us." The children, eager to please Sam, began throwing small stones at the woman, driving her away. She didn't shout or try to defend herself. Instead, she looked directly at Sam with a sorrowful gaze that made him uneasy. Just then, Jim, who had seen what happened, rushed over, furious. "Stop this at once," he shouted. "You're scaring this poor woman." Sam turned his back and muttered, "You're not my real father, Jim." Hurt but calm, Jim responded, "True enough, but I found you in the forest, and I showed you kindness." Hearing these words, the woman suddenly gasped, dropping to her knees, clearly shocked. Trembling, she asked, "This boy, did he wear a cloak of silver blue with stars on it?" Jim nodded, surprised. "Yes, he did." The woman fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. "Then he is mine. I am his mother," she whispered, barely able to speak. At these words, Jim gently led her into their home, offering her food and water. She sat by the table, too emotional to eat or drink. Sam was called inside, but when he entered and saw the woman, his heart filled with anger. "Where's my real mother?" he demanded. "This ragged woman is not my family." The woman rose and reached out to him. "My son, you are my child. I lost you many years ago, but I've searched far and wide to find you. Can't you see how much I love you?" Sam took a step back, closing his heart to her. "You must be mistaken. I'm not your real son. My real family wouldn't look like you." With a pained expression, the woman walked away, tears streaming down her face. As she left, Sam's heart remained cold. He was glad she was gone and returned to his friends. Sam's friends greeted him, but something had changed. They stared at him, their faces filled with surprise. "Why do you look so different?" they asked, keeping their distance. Confused, Sam ran to the well, looking to see his reflection. When he peered into the water, he was horrified. His beautiful face was gone. His skin was rough, and his features twisted. "My looks! What happened to me?" he whispered, trembling with shock. Overcome with regret, he realized how cruel he'd been, especially to the woman who claimed to be his mother. With a heavy heart, he resolved to make things right. The next morning, he began his search for the woman, calling out in the forest, "Mother, please forgive me." But no one answered. His sorrow grew, and he realized he was alone. During his search, he saw a small bird fluttering close by. Remembering how he used to hurt animals, he softly asked, "Have you seen my mother, little bird?" The bird chirped in response, but did not approach him, as though remembering the pain he once caused. Sam's guilt deepened, and he continued his search. For days he wandered the nearby villages and fields, growing weak from hunger but determined to find his mother. Villagers, too, avoided him, laughing at his new appearance, leaving him to fend for himself. One evening, he finally reached a village surrounded by stone walls. At the entrance, guards stopped him, asking, "What business do you have here?" "I'm searching for my mother. I made a terrible mistake, and I need her forgiveness," he pleaded. Hearing his story, the guards decided to sell him as a servant to an old man who needed help around his cottage. From that day on, Sam worked tirelessly, carrying out the old man's every request without complaint. He carried heavy stones, chopped wood, and helped in the fields. Each day was harder than the last, but he bore it all with a quiet determination. One day, after nearly a year of service, Sam heard news of a traveler who fit the description of his mother. With a hopeful heart, he asked for the chance to find her. The old man agreed, letting Sam leave with his blessing. When Sam finally found her, he fell to his knees, tears flowing freely. "Mother, please forgive me. I was foolish and unkind. I know now what I've lost because of my cruelty." The woman opened her arms, smiling with forgiveness. "I never stopped loving you, my son," she whispered, embracing him tightly. From that moment, Sam's life changed. He returned home to Jim and Mary, treating everyone with kindness, no matter their circumstances. His transformation touched the entire village, who welcomed him with open arms. He remained humble, always remembering the lessons he'd learned, and helped others however he could. At last, he found peace, not in his reflection, but in the love and kindness he showed to those around him. After the Star Child's rejection of his mother, he faced consequences more severe than he ever imagined. As he turned away from her tear-streaked face, he felt an unnatural heat overcome him. The beauty he had worn so proudly began to fade, melting into something twisted and vile. When he looked down, he saw his hands had transformed. His smooth skin was scaled and coarse. His once bright eyes clouded and dim. He had become monstrous, a reflection of the cruelty in his heart. Terrified, he fled the village, running to the very forest where he'd been found years before. His feet bled from thorns. His throat grew hoarse from cries. But he did not stop. He did not know where he was going, only that he could not bear the gaze of the villagers' horrifying eyes. His vanity shattered with each stumble, and soon he found himself in a lonely glen deep within the woods, far from anyone who had once known him. As night fell, he curled up on the cold ground, trembling from the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What have I become?" he whispered, his voice weak and choked with fear. "How could I reject her, my own mother?" The memory of her haunted his mind, her face soft with hope as she extended her hands to him. only to collapse when he turned her away. Days passed, and the Star Child wandered the forest, growing hungrier and weaker with each passing hour. He searched for food, but with his monstrous appearance, even the animals fled from him. His once clear thoughts became clouded with shame and regret, and he began to understand the depth of his past mistakes. He recalled every time he had laughed at others, every sneer he'd given to those who looked different. Now he was the one others ran from, the one who inspired fear and disgust. On one particularly cold morning, he stumbled upon a small brook. Kneeling, he gazed into the water, catching sight of his reflection once again. He shuddered at the creature staring back at him, his eyes hollow, his skin rough and scaled. The cruel face that once smirked so easily has now etched with sorrow and remorse. "Oh, mother," he whispered into the stillness. "I was blind. Please forgive me." The forest remained silent, the trees unmoved by his plea. In his desperation, the Star Child realized he had no choice but to find her, to seek out the woman he had once scorned. She was his only chance for forgiveness, his only hope of redemption. With newfound determination, he rose, clutching his heart with a resolve he had never felt before. The journey was arduous, his body exhausted and his spirit worn thin. He walked through vast fields and climbed rugged hills, never resting, never faltering. Every night he lay beneath the stars, their cold light a reminder of the cloak he had been wrapped in as a child, a cloak that no longer seemed to belong to him. One evening, as he stumbled through the village, he spotted a beggar curled up against a wall, shivering in the cold. She wore nothing but rags, her frame gaunt and frail. Though he had almost nothing to give, he approached her, removing his own tattered cloak and draping it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled by his kindness. "Why would you help me, creature?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Star Child lowered his head. "Because I was once just like you, scorned and ignored, and because I have caused suffering in my own blindness." The beggar's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand. "Then perhaps there is hope for you yet," she murmured, and with that she drifted off into a peaceful sleep. The Star Child moved on, his heart both heavy and lightened by the simple act of kindness. He continued on his way, driven by the faint hope that each act of compassion could undo a small piece of his past cruelty. "I know who you are, Star Child," the magician said, his voice a low rumble. "Once you lived a life of privilege, looking down on others, and now you have fallen." The Star Child's heart sank. "I'm aware of my faults, sir. I seek only to find my mother and beg her forgiveness." The magician smirked. "Forgiveness comes at a price. I shall grant you the freedom to seek her, but only if you complete 3 tasks for me. Fail, and you shall remain my servant forever." Swallowing hard, the Star Child nodded. "I will do whatever it takes." The first task was to find a piece of gold hidden deep within a labyrinth. The walls were cold, dark, and confining, and he struggled to find his way. Hours turned to days, but finally he discovered the gold. On his way back, he encountered a frail, hunched man begging for food. The Star Child, reminded of his own hunger and suffering, handed the gold to the man without hesitation. Returning empty-handed, he awaited the magician's wrath, but the magician only nodded. For your next task, find another piece of gold, deeper in the forest. Once again, the Star Child set off. This time, the journey was harsher, the landscape unfamiliar and full of pitfalls. He endured every hardship, and at last he retrieved the second piece of gold. As he made his way back, a small child approached him, her hands outstretched, eyes filled with desperation. His heart ached, and he gave her the gold, his own comfort forgotten. The third and final task was the most challenging yet. He had to venture to the farthest reaches of the desert, where the sun scorched his skin, and each step felt like it could be his last. Days passed, and at last he grasped the final piece of gold. This time, a young woman, battered and worn, crossed his path. The Star Child hesitated, but then, with a steady heart, he handed her the gold, his spirit free from regret. With renewed hope, the Star Child continued his journey, and after many more trials, he reached the city where he had last seen his mother. Entering, he caught sight of her amidst a crowded street, her face etched with sorrow and longing. He approached her slowly, heart pounding in his chest, terrified of her rejection. When she turned and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, then softened with recognition. "My son," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. He fell to his knees, bowing his head in shame. "Mother, I was a fool. I was blinded by pride and cruelty. I do not deserve your love or forgiveness, but I beg you, please, forgive me." She knelt beside him, her fingers tenderly brushing against his cheek. "Oh, my child," she murmured, "no beauty or ugliness could ever change my love for you. I have wandered for years to find you, and nothing you did could ever make me turn away." At her words, the warmth began to spread through his body. His scales softened, his twisted features began to smooth, and his skin returned to its former light. In that moment, the Star Child was restored, not because of his physical beauty, but because of the love and forgiveness in his mother's eyes. The Star Child stayed with his mother in the city, where the people soon learned of his past and the trials he had endured. They were drawn to his humility, his kindness, and his willingness to help others without judgment. Soon, a prophecy surfaced, a legend that spoke of a ruler who would bring peace and wisdom to the city. In time, the Star Child was crowned king, and with his mother at his side, he ruled with compassion and grace. Every decision he made was guided by the lessons he had learned, each act of kindness a reminder of the suffering he had once endured. He created homes for the poor, welcomed the beggars, and tended to the sick, offering solace to all who sought his help. Years later, when he felt his end was near, he gathered his people, looking upon their faces one last time. "Remember," he told them, his voice strong yet tender, "beauty is fleeting, but the heart lasts forever. Judge others not by their faces, but by the kindness in their souls." The story of the Star Child serves as a reminder that beauty is not skin deep and that true transformation comes from the heart. Through trials and suffering, he found the strength to change, seeking forgiveness and making amends. And in the end, his journey was not just about Reg.